So tonight, let me first say that a 20-minute talk, roughly, followed by about a 10-minute question and answer period. And if you have a comment or a question that you want addressed, you can use the chat box and it will appear on my screen. And I'll do my best to respond. Tonight I want to talk about mindfulness. And I hope that what I'm going to offer tonight will be useful to you, both in your meditation practice and in your daily lives. And I don't want to spend a bunch of time lost in terminology and historical context. I want this talk to be a little more about what we can use right now in our lives today. But I do need to cover a little bit of that so there'll be some framework for the practical aspects that I want to focus on. So the good news is that as of late, there's a great deal of interest in mindfulness. And it's taken decades for the mainstream of the culture in the West to take an interest in mindfulness, but it is happening. The bad news is that because of this broad interest, which we're all actively cultivating and we're happy to see, the rather precise meaning that the Buddha used when he talked about mindfulness has become diluted and clouded. And now the term mindfulness is routinely used to describe all kinds of mind states and practices and activities that go far beyond its original usage. So to talk about this, we need to start with a word from the Pali language. Pali was the language spoken in northern India during the time of the Buddha. And this word is sati. And sometimes you'll hear the statement that sati is the Pali word for mindfulness. And that's not exactly, I wouldn't quite say it that way. The Buddha didn't teach a concept that was named mindfulness. He taught sati in the language of his native country. So a better way to say it would be not that sati is the Pali word for mindfulness. A better way to say it would be mindfulness is the word that is most often, the English word that's most often used to translate the Pali word sati. And the concept of sati is subtle and it's nuanced, and there's no English word that precisely captures the meaning. Some teachers prefer the word awareness, but that brings its own set of complications with it too, which we won't go into tonight. So just for tonight's talk, I'm going to surrender to the word mindfulness as a translation of sati so that we can move ahead. Now, I want to share with you a quote about mindfulness, but first I want to ask you to join me in a little exercise. You know, ideally, we're all meditation practitioners and we're all very mindful and we're sitting here listening to a Dharma talk and our minds aren't wandering, but, you know, sometimes our minds do wander. And so I want to invite you to join me in this exercise. If you would, please close your eyes. And I'm going to read you 6 sentences. 6 sentences can sound like they last a long time. I'm going to read them slowly. And I want to ask you to pay particular attention to abide mindfully with what you're hearing. And these are the words of Philip Moffat. The Buddha taught that suffering comes from ignorance. Ignorance is the one thing with whose abandonment clear knowing arises, he said. By ignorance, he meant the misperceptions and delusions that your mind has about its own nature. In short, being ignorant of the Four Noble Truths. Thus, the way to free the mind from suffering is through gaining insight into what truly is. Insight is a profound level of understanding that transcends mere intellectual cognition and can only be known by experiencing it. One of the tools the Buddha taught for gaining insight is mindfulness, the ability to stay aware in the moment. Okay, thank you for that. So here he's making a very important set of connections. The first is mindfulness is one, not the only, but one of the tools the Buddha taught for gaining insight. The second connection is insight dispels ignorance. And the third connection is dispelling ignorance eliminates suffering, which is the goal of this path that we're on. Mindfulness yields insight, insight dispels ignorance, dispelling ignorance eliminates suffering. Sounds pretty simple. So that's the view from 10,000 feet, way up here. But what about those of us that are down here in the weeds, lost? What is this more precise meaning of mindfulness that the Buddha had in mind? And how can that inform our meditation practice and our daily lives? So the teacher Gil Fronsdal points out that in his teaching, the Buddha used the term mindfulness in two related but different ways. One is as a mental faculty of mindfulness, and the other is as a practice of mindfulness. So as to the first, the mental faculty, there's a really strong correlation between mindfulness and remembering. The two share a common root word in the Pali language. That's how closely connected they are. They arise from the same word. And what remembering and mindfulness have in common is the mental activity of holding something in awareness. When I'm remembering, I'm engaged in the mental activity of holding something in awareness. When I'm being mindful, I'm engaged in the mental activity of holding something in awareness. So think about a time that maybe you missed a class in school or you missed a meeting at work. So what are the chances that you will ever remember what was said in that class or that meeting? So the chance is zero, right? Because you weren't there to hear it. Now, think about a time when you were in a class or a meeting or listening to a Dharma talk, but you weren't really paying attention. Instead, you were thinking about what happened in your day or what might happen the upcoming weekend. So while you were present in the room when the words were spoken, your attention was elsewhere. And again, the chances of you remembering what was said are pretty slim. Most of us see this kind of thing in our lives very regularly. Somebody will be having a conversation and somebody will say, well, didn't you hear them say that? Or don't you remember that this was said? And we'll be like, no, I don't remember that. So that can be a big clue for us that we're not being mindful in the moment when something like that happens. So bhikkhus, these two monks, many of you will know who these monks are, bhikkhus Nanamoli and bhikkhu Bodhi, did a translation of one of the Nikayas, the collection of discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya. And in their commentary, their observation is, keen attentiveness to the present forms the basis for an accurate memory of the past. I'm going to read that again. Keen attentiveness to the present forms the basis for an accurate memory of the past. So some of you have heard the story of Clarence Darrow and the trick he used during the Scopes trial in 1925. Now, let me just say, I've heard this story, and I looked it up to kind of make sure I had all my facts right before I used it tonight. And not everybody agrees this is a true story, but it's a great story, so I'm going to tell it anyway because I like it and it makes a great point. So Clarence Darrow was defending, he was a lawyer, he was defending a teacher who was accused of violating a Tennessee law by teaching evolution in the classroom. 1925, almost 100 years ago, the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, was making his closing arguments to the jury. This was his big chance to clinch the case and win everybody over. And so before this proceeding began, Darrow took a hat pin and he inserted it right down the middle of his cigar. And this was back when you could smoke a cigar in a courtroom. And he lit the cigar just as Bryan was beginning his speech. And then he just sat back with the cigar in his mouth and he remained motionless through Bryan's speech. And the longer the cigar burned, and the longer the ash on the cigar got, the more the jury members couldn't take their eyes off of that ash because they were waiting for it to fall on his vest. But of course, they didn't know that it was never going to fall on his vest because he'd put the hat pin in there to hold it together. Bryan's eloquent speech wasn't really heard by the jurors because their attention wasn't on his words. Their attention was on Darrow's cigar ash. So that's a pretty good trick. I think this idea that we're not really paying attention and we don't remember things, that has a connection to another phenomenon that you'll hear people relate, which is that in times of crisis, people often report their experience feels like things shift into slow motion. And I had this experience myself. Many years ago, I was in a serious automobile crash. And I remember so clearly that everything just dropped into slow motion. I couldn't believe it. And I think when it's critical for us to pay careful attention, intense intention, we have the ability to do that. A car crash, maybe we're being the victim of a violent crime. We can drop in and pay so much attention to every moment of experience, but we just don't usually do that. We don't need to, we think we don't need to, and we don't really know it's possible. So now I want to share another 6-sentence quote. It's not going to be too long. And I'm going to invite you again to close your eyes and listen mindfully to these 6 sentences. And again, these are the words of Andy Olinsky, Buddhist scholar and practitioner, from his essay, One Thing at a Time. He says, mental energy is finite, and our mind is diminished in direct proportion to how much its attention is fractured. The problem is not so much attention deficit as it is attention dispersion, when the available attention is spread thin. Just like water spreading out to cover a surface, the wider the expanse, the shallower the depth. By trying to do many things at once, we are training the mind to process information in ways that may well be effective and even become habitual, but the price to be paid for this is no longer being deeply aware of what we are doing. Each moment of consciousness is a precious gift. Awareness itself is the primary currency of the human condition, and as such, it is inherently of immense value and deserves to be spent carefully. Thank you. So back to this two-pronged meaning of mindfulness, the mental faculty and the practice. What about this practice component? So again, I'm going to paraphrase Gil Fronsdal. He says, mindfulness is not a practice, rather it is a manner of how to practice. If we abide mindfully, observing the breath, then breath awareness is the practice, and mindfulness is the manner in which we undertake the practice. It is the frame of reference from which we operate. Now, this is a critical distinction, and when we don't understand this, we can become confused about where we should place our attention during meditation. The attention is on the breath or our other chosen object. Mindfulness is the attitude with which we approach the object. So this is relevant when we examine the relationship between abiding in the present moment and abiding in the past or the future. Let's just say, instead of past and future, remembering and planning. So when we are being guided into a meditation period, it's common to hear the teacher instruct us to let go of the past and the future. I say that often when I'm guiding in. So does this mean that we can never bask in the joy of remembering a pleasant experience? Does it mean that we can never utilize our memories to learn from and to guide us toward better decisions in the future? Will the mindfulness police give us a citation if we use our ability to plan ahead so that the events in our lives will unfold smoothly? Do we have to wait until there's no more toilet paper in the house before we decide to restock? Happily, the answer is no. We don't have to completely abandon thoughts of the past and the future. It's not the activities of planning and remembering that are the problem. Rather, it's our relationship to them. It can be our relationship to them. So if we are habitually, unconsciously dwelling in the past and the future, that is not abiding mindfully. Meditation is sometimes referred to as mind training, and part of the training we undertake is to make choices which are more conscious. When remembering or planning are appropriate, then we mindfully engage in them. That's the way we do them, mindfully. We do so for only as long as it's useful, and then we consciously return the attention to the present moment. In this way, we honor the idea that mindfulness is the manner in which we undertake each activity, not the activity itself. So what about when we experience strong desire or aversion while we're abiding mindfully? Sometimes we hear the definition of mindfulness as including the word non-judgmental. So again, I'll quote Andy Olinsky here. This was from an article he wrote in this spring's issue of Tricycle magazine. He says, the Buddhist use of mindfulness specifies that the conscious awareness will also include an attitude of equanimity, one that neither favors nor opposes the object of which one is aware. It is this capacity to separate awareness from the common reflex of continual judging that can be transformative. Craving is the cause of suffering. So as we cultivate mindfulness, the objective is not just to be fully aware of each arising and passing moment, but to do so with equanimity. The last point I want to make, I'm going to close now, is that one way we do this is we do it by experimentation, trial and error. The Buddha did not reach awakening because he followed someone else's instructions. He did so by rolling up his sleeves and getting his hands dirty. He did so by undertaking years of experimentation. In his essay, Mindfulness Defined, Thanissaro Bhikkhu says, liberating insight comes from testing and experimenting. This is how we learn about the world to begin with. If we weren't active creatures, we'd have no understanding of the world at all. If you want to learn about the potential of the mind, you have to be willing to play. Play with sensations in the body and play with qualities of the mind. That's when you come to understand cause and effect. So, I hope these thoughts about mindfulness are useful. And as I said, if anybody wants to chat in a question or a comment, I'll do what I can within the time we have available to respond. And if not, we all know how to sit quietly. So here's a question. I'm glad somebody asked this question. Does the Pali language exist in its entirety today, or is it fragmented? I don't know if I can exactly answer that. Here's what I can tell you. It's not a spoken language today. It is merely the language of the Pali canon, that is the record of the Buddhist teachings from the time that it was the language, the common language. So you won't be having a conversation with anybody in Pali, but does it exist in its entirety or is it fragmented? I think the scholars who are quite knowledgeable about it would generally agree that it's pretty clear what Pali words meant. Now, there are always going to be subtle differences in the way people translate things, but I think generally it's pretty much intact as a written language. Can you spell the name of the author you quoted at length? Well, I think I quoted two authors at length. I quoted Philip Moffitt, so that's M-O-F-F-I-T, Philip Moffitt. And then I quoted Andy Olinsky at length, and his last name is spelled O-L-E-N-D-Z-K-I. So here's a question that is, the question is being mindful the same thing as being aware of the moment? I mean, generally, yes. When we get down to examining refined states of consciousness, the more examination we do, the more subtle discrimination can take place. And so I'm sure that there are people who would take a very technical approach to the phrase aware of the moment and say, no, mindfulness is this and aware of the moment is that. And maybe that's true on some minuscule level. But I think general conversation, the term I like to use is present moment awareness. Mindfulness is present moment awareness. Knowing what's true in this moment, knowing that I'm tired of sitting in this chair, my bottom's a little tired, and I'm a little anxious about what time it is and if I'm running out of time, and I'm watching the different thumbnails are flashing in and out on the screen. And so just knowing in each moment what's true instead of being lost in stories. And I think aware of the moment is a pretty good phrase for that. And I will respond to one more. The question is a cadence in breathing helpful? So what I'm going to say is that in insight meditation, the practice is to know what's true in each moment, and that's true with the breath. And so if the term cadence in breathing means to regulate the breathing, the answer is no, that is not the classic practice. If cadence in breathing means to observe the cadence of the breath as it changes over time, then I would say yes, that is helpful. So really it's mindfully being aware of the experience of the breath moment by moment as it changes, but not controlling. Okay. We have a few announcements, and then we will close with our loving kindness meditation. So one of the eminent scholars that I quoted tonight, Bhikkhu Bodhi, many of you know this, was scheduled to be in Charlotte next Wednesday and speak to us. This was before the coronavirus. And in lieu of that, he will be addressing us as our guest leader next week via Zoom. So we will start at 7 o'clock, not 7:30 next week. So don't show up at 7:30 and be disappointed that you missed half of the presentation. I don't know how many people a Zoom account can accommodate. It's not unlimited, but I'm going to get here early so that if we reach capacity, I'm going to be here to hear what he has to say. The title of his talk is Changing the Mind, Changing the World. He will inquire into the particular Buddhist teachings that can form a theoretical basis for engaged Buddhism and the ways these teachings can be applied to the work of creating a more just and sustainable world. And if you want to read more about that, it's on the website. On August 15, from 9 in the morning until noon, we'll be participating in a community service event. And uncharacteristically, this will be in person. It'll be at Second Harvest Food Bank. And they have implemented the CDC guidelines necessary to ensure that everybody can show up in person and do this community service. Again, more information on the website. The fall 2020 book discussion, which will be held on Zoom beginning Thursday, September 3rd. The book is Deep Hope. I should have practiced before I read this, by Diane Rizento. The discussion group is led by Joy Lybeth, and her contact information is on the website. If we were in person, I would say there is a Dana back box at the back of the room. Dana is the Pali word for generosity. But instead, what I will say is there is a way to donate to this. If you want to provide financial support to this community, there's a way to do that at our website. So we invite you, if you want to do that, that is the way to do it. Okay, why don't we conclude with our loving kindness practice. So if you want to find a comfortable posture for a few moments of meditation. So before we begin, just call to mind, if you would, any being or beings that you'd like to hold in loving kindness during our practice tonight. If we were together in person, I would ask you to call out the first names of those beings. As it is, we'll just hold them in our minds and our hearts together. I'll offer phrases that you can repeat silently to yourself. And we'll begin with loving kindness or metta directed toward ourselves. May I be safe from inner and outer harm. May I be happy and content. May I be healthy in body and mind. And may I live a life of well-being, free from suffering. Then turning our attention to another being or beings, and we'll include here all of the beings that were brought to mind a moment ago. May you be safe from inner and outer harm. May you be happy and content. May you be healthy in body and mind. And may you live a life of well-being, free from suffering. And finally, broadening our metta or loving kindness practice out to all beings everywhere. May all beings be safe from inner and outer harm. May all beings be happy and content. May all beings be healthy in body and mind. And may all beings, without exception, live lives of well-being, free from suffering. Before you sign off, I want to clarify 2 announcements. Since people can chat things in, there's room for 500 people next week, so maybe we don't have to show up quite as early. And if you want to register for the second harvest event, you do that by contacting Gail Goforth, and her contact information is on the website. Have a lovely evening.